So I watched this a couple of times. I watched it a couple days ago for the second time. And after watching it, I figured I'd just cobble a few notes together.
Is that better? There. And then in the middle of the day today, I get an email from Dr. Schultz with a 12-page paper that he's going to present on some night this week that I'm not going to be here. And I felt like an idiot because I hadn't really prepared much by way of formality. But as a Dr. Chapsell professor used to say, the proximate preparation is scanty, but the remote preparation is enormous. I hope that's the case. So anyhow, the video that you just watched, the little kind of mini documentary, presents an analysis of reality which assumes or implies that reality has a meaning. You know, it talks about the biological order and the natural order, and even the old mythological, writings, in such a way that implies that this order has a sort of a sign character, right, or that it signifies something. And up until relatively recently, maybe not relatively recently anymore, but relatively recently in the grand scheme of things, that view of the world was the predominant view of the world. That the fact that there is sexual complementarity in the natural order isn't just a brute biological fact, but tells us something about the nature of reality that we can learn from, or whatever. And so what I thought I might do is a couple things. The first thing I'd like to do, and I'll do all this quickly, I think, is say a little bit about the history of how that has changed. Why is it that the typical modern person no longer looks at the natural order and sees anything kind of other than brute biological fact? How do we get to that point? Because that's an interesting thing to think about. And I think a lot of times, the way these sorts of discussions are framed, it seems like one side represents perhaps a narrowly sort of Christian view, and the other side presents a sort of modern, scientific view. But the history of the thing is a little more complicated than that. The view that this documentary sort of reflects is much older than Christianity. I mean, it's found in the old myths, but it's also found in the first way, perhaps systematically, in classical philosophy. So I'll just say a couple things about that, and I'll talk about kind of how that changed. And then the second thing I want to say something about, is kind of quickly, is that even given that view, let's say the classical / Christian view of nature is the one that makes the most sense. It has to be acknowledged that both within the classical view and in the Christian view, there's a sense in which the natural order is not simply transparent to meaning. And so why is that? So for Plato and Aristotle, it's because we're pretty far from the gods, right? We've fallen pretty far. And for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam to some degree, it's because of some sort of a fall, right? Something that caused nature to become sort of twisted. So I'll say something about both of those in 10 minutes. My students are like, yeah, right. So no, I'm try to do my best to avoid what Schultz did. But anyhow, so let's go back to Plato and Aristotle just for a minute. Both philosophers, for all of their differences, and sometimes we overplay their differences, I think, in these history of philosophy textbooks, I tend to kind of think of them as both allies and not so much alternatives. But both of them, what they share in common is they present a picture of the natural order as proceeding from some sort of fundamental reason, or the Greek word they use is logos. So the natural order proceeds from logos and is ordered to logos, so someday we'll return back to that reasonable origin. But in the meantime, all of reality is reflective of that logos or that order, obviously in a fragmented way, but yet still it's there. So nature for them is shot through with the meaning of the logos out of which it came. And it's not so much an act of creation. Aristotle's universe has no beginning, for instance, in time. It's more of an ontological priority of logos to stuff, matter, brute, kind of, there's no brute matter, in reality, for either Aristotle or Plato. And the nature of that logos, that being, that origin, that everything comes from, they're both going to say has certain properties that we see reflections of in the natural order. And those three of those big things we call the transcendentals are truth, goodness, and beauty. And so in both Plato and Aristotle, you can't separate, say, philosophy from ethics, from aesthetics. When they're doing philosophy, they're doing ethics. When they're doing ethics, they're doing aesthetics. And when they're doing aesthetics, they're doing philosophy. So they're really bad at dividing things up the way we do in the modern university, which makes them kind of interesting. So those big transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, they're going to see reflected in the natural order. And it's really interesting, their ethics is an attempt to do justice to the nature of things, right? So what's going to happen then, after Plato and Aristotle, of course, do their thing, a few years later, a few hundred years later, Christianity comes on the scene. And it's really interesting, Pope Benedict makes this point that the early Christians, there were really two sides of the debate going on in the early Roman Empire. That was between the mythologists, the poets on the one hand, and the philosophers on the other. And you would kind of think, because the poets believed in gods and the philosophers were kind of atheistic skeptics, that the Christians would have sided with the poets, right, the religious people. But in fact, the early Christians sided almost unanimously, with the philosophers, right? Which is like, what? And the early Romans called Christians atheists for that reason, which is really interesting, right? So they were considered rationalists in the Roman Empire, rather than kind of fideists or believers. They were called impious. Remember, Socrates was killed for impiety. A lot of Christians were killed for impiety too. So that's something I think kind of fascinating. I mention it now because what happens is the early Christians take up that notion that the universe proceeds from logos and is ordered to logos and reflective of logos. And of course, the only thing they kind of add to the mix is doctrine of creation. So in Christianity, God explicitly creates on purpose through his word, through his logos. And so it's as if, sorry, I have really bad allergies this time of year. My voice is kind of shot, but I think you can probably hear me anyhow. The things of this world contain within them an idea or a meaning or a word that can be known, right? So that gets kind of taken up in the Christian view. And so there's really not much of a radical shift in terms of cosmology or even of ethics when Christianity gets introduced. In many ways, Christianity just repristinates Platonic and Aristotelian ethics. I mean, it adds a few, distinct elements. I wouldn't want to downplay. I mean, some of the important things are, for instance, that all human beings have equal dignity. That would be a big Christian addition, which we're kind of glad over. Aristotle didn't think that was true. Plato didn't think that was true. But there was a kind of common ethos there. And then just kind of very quickly, all of that worldview that I've been talking about and just kind of reflected in the documentary that you just watched begins to unravel in the late Middle Ages. And there's all sorts of reasons for this, historical reasons, plagues, bad stuff starts to happen. The birth of modern science is huge in this regard. And that notion that nature reveals a kind of underlying spiritual meaning just begins to be doubted, and people start to get a very pessimistic and bleak view. Hobbes says that nature is brutish and short, life is brutish and short, kind of violent and essentially kind of evil. Descartes doesn't have a very high view of nature either. In fact, Descartes says that everything in nature outside of the soul of the human person is a machine. Descartes didn't think that animals could feel pain because machines don't feel pain. So he would poke a dog with a pin, the dog would yelp, and he would say, It's just as if you're pushing down one end of a seesaw and the other end goes up. That's what a dog's yelp means with a pin. A dog has no interiority for Descartes. Only human beings for Descartes have souls, which is something that's not true in Plato, Aristotle, or Thomas Aquinas. They all believe that plants and animals have souls too. How about that? Right, so Christians are much more pantheistic than most Christians realize. You can write that down. We all become Cartesians. Most Christians are not Cartesians. They just think they're Christians. Right. So once Descartes does that, what happens to nature is nature becomes literally a meaningless machine. And the only thing that could give it meaning would be an arbitrary God that's outside of nature on the one hand. So God becomes a machine maker, watchmaker. That becomes a favored analogy for God in the modern period, which is a terrible analogy for God, by the way. And because he makes living things, he doesn't make machines, right? That's a huge difference. But also the spiritual soul of the human person becomes the active vis-a-vis a totally passive nature. Nature is meaningless in itself, but we can give it meaning because we are meaning makers. Just like God is a meaning maker, watchmaker, sort of thing. And God's decision to make a universe is arbitrary, and we can kind of give nature arbitrarily any meaning we want. So this kind of leads to a worldview known as dualism, where there's this spiritual component in the heart of the human person, and everything else it has no meaning, including, very importantly, eventually, the human body. Right? So the modern world would never say that the body itself has a meaning. They would say that the spiritual subject makes meaning, but there's nothing inherent to recognize. So that you get the beginning of the unraveling of that. Eventually, what happens very recently then is all we have to do is just cut off the watchmaker God, because we don't need him anymore, because biologists will now, some of them at least, will tell us that the universe can make itself out of kind of chaos and law, a mixture of chance and necessity. The universe kind of comes about itself. But in a universe that's kind of a weird mixture of chance and necessity, again, nature can have no positive meaning. Hume says you cannot get an ought from an is. But that's because for Hume, nature is just brute mechanism. There's nothing in it. So that would be something that maybe we could talk about, is this documentary clearly favors, if you want to say it that way, or perhaps even presupposes this older, what I would call sacramental view of the universe, but that's not the world we live in. Doesn't accept that view of the universe anymore. That's just kind of a given. Religion, therefore, is private, it's subjective, it's based on revelation, all that stuff, right? A final point then about the fact that both the ancients and the Christians would agree that what we see of meaning in the universe is fragmented, because the universe is in some sense not a full reflection of meaning. In other words, Plato and Aristotle and Christians would not deny that the universe is kind of a mess also, right? So it makes mistakes. People are born handicapped. There's violence in nature. They wouldn't deny any of that, but they would read all of that as against a backdrop of order. So for them, the disorder and the ugliness and the evil that we find in the universe presupposes order. It's a lack, or it's a privation. It's not the fundamental nature of things. But what happens in the beginning of modernity is you begin to see the universe as fundamentally messed up. And this is why technology takes on such importance in the modern world, because if you think that nature is fundamentally messed up, technology is your only chance at hopefully making it kind of meaningful. In Christianity, final point, we add to that notion that nature doesn't perfectly reflect God with a nature of human fallenness, that we've all been affected by not just the fragmented nature of nature, but we've also been affected by sin. And so it would be weird to expect that any of us experiences in our actual concrete daily experience a perfect accord with the natural order of things. All of our desires are kind of messed up in a fallen world, right? And so this kind of beautiful picture of marriage, which you can kind of fundamentally affirm if you're a Catholic, you also have to kind of acknowledge as a Catholic or a Christian that most of us don't measure up to that calling, that what we experience in our actual desires is disordered passions, et cetera, et cetera. So it remains a kind of norm to aspire towards, but because we're all kind of messed up, we all have to be really patient with each other as we get to that place where we're kind of called to be, if you will. So there's no place in a Christian framework for any sort of, quote, judgmentalism or pointing the finger. The person you want to point the finger at is always yourself, right? Because if you don't know you're messed up, then you're not a Christian, right? I mean, that's kind of how that works. So I will leave it at that, and hopefully, questions or conversations about any of that or any of this would be great. So I'm going to stop.